driving along with a friend and we're going to the park. Or I went to the park with a picnic lunch. You see me kind of carrying along a picnic lunch. But yet if I said I went to the park with a statue, you don't see me walking along arm in arm with a statue going to the park. You know that when I say the park with a statue, what I mean is it's the park that has a statue in it. Even though in all three of those sentences, up to and including the word with, they're identical. I went to the park with a friend, a picnic lunch, a statue. But yet you completely assign the meaning of the word with differently because of that external knowledge. We know you can go with a friend beside you and you can carry a picnic lunch, but you don't usually, you're not usually accompanied by a statue. That's the thing that's at the park. Or something like the city council banned the protesters meeting because they feared violence. When you hear the word they, you automatically assume you're talking about the city council. They feared violence. But if I said the city council banned the protesters meeting because they advocated violence, at the moment you hear the word they, you're more likely to interpret it as referring to the protesters, because our external knowledge, we know protesters are more likely to advocate violence than a city council, and city councils are more likely to fear violence rather than advocate it. But up to and including the word they, the sentences are identical. The city council banned the protesters meeting because they advocated violence or feared violence. We don't even get the information that we use to assign the meaning to the word they until after the word they in the sentence. And sometimes we can become so conditioned to a context that it almost becomes difficult to semantically interpret it any other way. An example I've used before is, you know, the old cliche, time flies like an arrow, you know, where you're kind of metaphorically interpreting time going really fast like an arrow would go. What completely other semantic interpretation could you give to that sentence, though? But we get really locked into that. It's almost difficult to think of that any other way. Besides any kind of metaphor about time going by quick, like an arrow does, what else semantically could that sentence mean? Time flies like an arrow.
It's linear, you can't go back in time.
Sure, that's another relationship of time. It is still associating it with time, the clock kind of thing. Just another way of looking at it, linear. That's interesting.
Time as in the slice flies like an arrow? Is that?
Okay, I guess if you threw a bottle of time or something and it went like an arrow, that's on the right track though.
I'm just trying to think of how.
Well, think of the flying example. Let's say I have a bird and my bird's name is Time, and every time my bird Time flies, she goes up and down, just like an arrow would. Time flies like an arrow. My bird Time goes up and down, just like an arrow would. Or let's say I've got this arrow in my backyard, and there's a certain kind of fly called a time fly, you know, the little insect. And those time flies really love that arrow in my backyard all the time. All those flies are buzzing around the arrow. Time flies like an arrow. And you see the idea in terms of other kinds of context. Any other ones? I mean, you really could keep going on and on and on. There was at least one more that I had down that I thought was a good example. Oh yeah, another one is the act of timing an arrow. Let's say you have a stopwatch, and there's a certain way that you would time an arrow in terms of its taking its trajectory, and we want to time flies, the little insects, the same way that we time arrows. So I give you a stopwatch, and I say time flies like an arrow. Time these flies buzzing around the same way that you would time an arrow. All three of those make perfectly good semantic context, but we get so locked into thinking of the context a certain way, sometimes it becomes more difficult, you know, to see it, you know, to interpret it a different way. So, just lots of good practical applications and examples of that top-down processing. A whole nother, and I won't go into specific theories as much as the concept here, but a whole nother aspect in terms of language comprehension. There's a whole group of theories that are basically attention theories. And what a lot of these attention theories focus on is the idea that the human mind has a lot more ability to process and understand language than most of the time we have to use. In other words, we've got a lot of extra mental potential to process language than we normally have to use in our day-to-day communication. So what happens a lot of times is we get lazy with our listening. There's some studies that show that in a lot of day-to-day communication, we actually only pay attention to about 30 to 45% of the communication that's being said, and that's because for a lot of our day-to-day communication, that's all the attention that it takes. Well, what some of these studies have shown, and related concepts and theories, is that when people are exposed to situations that are a little more challenging, and they think things like, gee, I can't understand, or I can't comprehend, or something like that, it's not that they don't have the mental ability to process that language or that communication, it's that given the normal limited amount of attention that we pay, we aren't able to understand or aren't able to keep up. Classic example of this, there's been research done on speech rate. You know, the average day-to-day speaker speaks at 120 to 150 words a minute. The average college student's word processing ability is 400 to 500 words a minute. Well, what does that mean? That means that the average speaker talking 120 to 140, 150 words a minute only requires less than a half of our actual attentiveness. So when people are suddenly exposed to a faster speech rate, let's say 200 words a minute instead of 120 or 150, some people say, wow, that's just too fast, I can't keep up. Even 200 words a minute is still only half of 400 words a minute. It's that if you're listening to 200 words a minute, the same way you listen to 120 words a minute, you are not going to be able to keep up and you're not going to be able to understand. That doesn't mean that we don't have the attentive ability, it just means that we get locked into only using a fraction of our attentiveness. And what some of the research has shown, speech rates being one example, is that when people adjust their attentiveness to accommodate the faster speech rate, in other words, they listen more attentively because of the faster speech rate, not only do they end up keeping up, they actually end up overcompensating and remembering and understanding and processing more information at the faster speech rate. One in particular study showed that anywhere from 240 words a minute to 280 words a minute, which is a lot faster than average communication. When people increase their attentiveness to accommodate the faster speech rate, they actually process and comprehend more information at the faster speech rate than they do with the slower speech rate. This is an easy thing to adjust to. If any of you have ever been to an auction, auctioneers are some of the fastest speech rates. I mean, they're up there at 350, maybe 400 words a minute. You go to your first auction, you're sitting back and you might not be able to understand anything except sold to the lady in the purple hat with the green feather. But when you go to more auctions and you get used to it, you find all of a sudden you can now understand a lot more about what the auctioneer is saying, even though he or she's not talking any slower or any more clearly. You just learn to adjust your attentiveness to accommodate the faster speech rate. Another area that this idea of attention theories has been studied, we talked about this in the 110 class, is when we're exposed to distraction, where we're processing communication, but there's some kind of distraction in the environment. Well, what some research has shown is that when there's a low level or moderate level distraction, people actually process more information than when there's no distraction. Well, what's the obvious theoretical explanation? Why, when there's a distraction, would you process more?
Because you're trying harder to pay attention.
Absolutely. You're increasing your concentration, you're increasing your efforts to attend, and you actually end up overcompensating and you process more information. So lots of these kinds of examples. This is outside the purview of language processing, but there's even been studies done in terms of things like academic or intellectual tasks or tests, where when there's some low-level distraction, people perform better on the test. One particular example I'm thinking of was a study on 7th grade biology classes, where when there was some kind of like distraction in the background, like music or something, their scores actually improved. Now, one exception to that, you have to be dealing with information that's not too complex, because if you're listening to complex information, or the distraction is really extreme, you're not going to be able to process more and do better because you're already having to use a lot of attention because it's really complex, or the distraction is too extreme that you can't overcome it. I mean, if a noise is really too loud, you're not even going to be able to hear. So the idea here with a lot of these attention theories, the things that a lot of these have in common is we have a lot more mental ability to comprehend language and communication than most of the time we have to use. And as a result, most of your day-to-day communicators, they get in lazy listening habits. They only listen with a fraction of their attentive ability, because that's what most of the day-to-day communication, that's all it requires. And then when they're suddenly exposed to more challenging communication, a lot of times they might not think that they can comprehend, but it's only, or a lot of times, it's mainly because they're listening with the same amount of attentiveness that they listen in all these other situations, without realizing you've got all this extra mental ability that is just lying there dormant, that we can use and we can devote towards whatever the source of the information is. Questions or anything on the attention? You kind of see the idea there. One other final thing to do with language processing, and some of this we've been talking with and applying with our other theories, but just to get a little more specific, and that's the idea of language and memory. We actually do have memory for all four of the structural parts of language, phonemes, morphemes, syntax, semantics. We actually do have a phonetic memory. In other words, we can remember sounds independent of remembering what the words are themselves. My example I gave earlier would be the classic example about trying to remember somebody's name, and you start going through the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and you finally get to the letter. Oh yeah, it was something that started with a J, and you start going through all the J names. Well, we use that as activation theory, but what that's also talking about is phonetic memory, because you remember, you activate the recognition of the memory of the sound of the first letter of the name, even though you might not really remember what the name is at all. Obviously, we have morphological memory. That would be remembering an exact word, the entire word. When you're memorizing your vocabulary terms is morphological memory. Syntactic memory, the structure of a sentence. This is a memory that we usually don't use unless we're prompted to, but you do have it in there. Syntactic memory would be remembering something verbatim. Where you get that in academics a lot is where an instructor says, remember this definition word for word. Or if I ask a class a question, if I say something like, okay, what's top-down processing? And somebody repeats back and says, it's how we process words and meaning in relation to semantic context. Well, that's exactly the way that I phrased it when I gave one of the explanations or one of the descriptions. That would be syntactic memory, where you remember the exact structural order of a sentence. When you're studying theater or in a play or something like that, that requires syntactic memory, right? You've got to remember the exact lines of the script, exactly the way that they're written. So, we do have memory for all three of those. However, semantic memory, the fourth type of memory, that's the memory that tends to have priority. Most of our day-to-day language memory is semantic memory. We tend to remember the essence of what was said without necessarily remembering the exact words that were used to say it or the exact order of the words that were used to say it. Unless we're otherwise prompted, generally, most of our day-to-day communication priority goes to our semantic memory. We tend to remember the underlying meaning, rather than the specific words or the specific phrases. One of the kinds of studies that has verified this idea in terms of semantic memory, and this is a particular effect, it's called the restoration effect. And what the restoration effect is where somebody's listened to communication, and when they're asked to recall what was said, they correct errors in the communication. If there's mispronunciations, or if there's grammatical mistakes, when they recall what was said, there's a tendency to correct or restore the sentence to what its correct form should be. And again, that's one of the kinds of studies or one of the kinds of effects that is used to support this idea of priority goes to semantic memory. We're not really focusing on the pronunciation of the words and the exact grammatical structure of the sentence. We're getting the gist of the sentence, and then when we're asked to recreate it or to recall it and repeat it, a lot of times we tend to correct or restore it to what its correct form would be. Back to when we were talking about people mispronouncing words. If you hear somebody mispronounce the word, and it's a word that you correctly pronounce, when you're asked to recall what they say, you're more likely to recall it with the correct pronunciation rather than with the incorrect pronunciation that they said. Another interesting kind of effect, I guess we could make this number one here in terms of language and memory, the restoration effect, which relates to semantic memory. There's another kind of effect when we're talking about language and memory, or memory and information in general. It's referred to as a modality effect. And what a modality effect is where the mode of communication creates a different effect. In other words, if you're talking about written information compared to spoken information, if you have a difference in the way that we remember or recall written versus spoken communication, even if it's the same message, what that basically is a modality effect. The mode itself, you know, the channel of through which the information is conveyed, can create a difference in terms of how we remember that. One example of a modality effect, and you have this on your handout, if you look at the top part right above the semantic network we were talking about, this graphs out the example of one particular study where, and this is not talking about necessarily words, this is talking about just numbers in a sequence, but it does show an example of the modality effect where you're looking at basically a primacy and a recency effect. You know, primacy is where the earlier information we tend to remember better. Recency is the more recent information we remember better. And in your first little graph there, or your first little diagram, what you can see is when people were listening to these series of numbers spoken aloud, and then they're asked to recall them, there's both the primacy effect and the recency effect. So when you're looking at the curve, that's showing how many of the numbers they got correctly. So when you look at the beginning part, you see the primacy, how many of the early numbers were remembered. And the dotted line is how many were remembered when it was written instead of spoken. The solid line is how many were remembered when it was spoken. So both have the primacy effect, and they both kind of come down to the middle range when you're in the middle. But look at the difference in terms of the recency effect. When you're talking about the spoken information, there's much more of a recency effect than there is with the written. There was a much higher recall of the recent information they heard compared to the recent information that they read. And what this has been labeled as is a special type of memory for processing speech information instead of written information. The abbreviation is PAS, and what PAS stands for is pre-categorical acoustic storage. Pre-categorical acoustic storage. Now, if you understand why that's the phrase, there's less I think you actually have to memorize. Acoustic means sound. Storage, what you remember. Pre-categorical, remembering the sound independent of what it means before you semantically categorize it. So basically, pre-categorical acoustic storage is this special short-term memory we have for processing spoken communication, uniquely different from processing written communication. And again, that becomes one of the only likely theoretical explanations for why you would have a greater recency effect when you're dealing with spoken language than you have when you're dealing with written language. We must be remembering it somehow differently because we hear it out loud. You know, possibly, I don't know if this works or not, but one practical application of that might be something like your last minute studying that you're doing right before an exam. If you say the information out loud instead of just reading the information, your very last minute studying, then the results would indicate that you might have a better likelihood of remembering those last things you went over if you hear it rather than if you just read it. Now, what might mitigate against that is when you look at the next little diagram, which is talking about when you include a suffix. And what they mean by a suffix is after you've processed the information that you're supposed to remember, you then hear something else. So a spoken suffix is, like in this example, you hear the number, that sequence of numbers, and then after the numbers have been said, somebody says something else. Well, can you see the dotted line here represents when there is that spoken, when there's that spoken suffix. Somebody says something after the information you're supposed to remember. Can you see how the recency effect drops down almost exactly the same that the written information was before? So basically what that's saying is that pre-categorical acoustic storage, it's just a very short-term memory. You know, because as soon as you hear something else said after the information you're supposed to remember, that then becomes the information stored in PAS rather than the information that you're actually trying to remember. I think another good example of some of that recent, you know, pre-categorical acoustic storage, I know this happens to me a lot, I'm assuming this happens to other people as well, where you're listening to the radio or you're listening to the music or something like this, and whatever the last song was that was on, all of a sudden that just starts going through your mind again and again and again and again, and it's not until you hear another song that then that one goes out of your mind, and then you might be thinking of that most recent song. Again, I think that's kind of a day-to-day sort of example where we might experience some of that pre-categorical acoustic storage. Now, the application to my example of a test, right before the exam, you say a bunch of stuff out loud to remember, but according to the spoken suffix, that means as soon as you come in and sit down in class, if somebody starts talking to you before you start the exam, then all of a sudden that becomes the pre-categorical acoustic storage, and the other recent information is no longer there. So pre-categorical acoustic storage is a special short-term memory we have for processing spoken language independent of written language. So it's not the information, it's the mode of the information. So pre-categorical acoustic storage would be one example of a type of modality effect. Modality effect in general is if the mode or the channel of communication influences the way we process it. Pre-categorical acoustic storage is just one example of that. We have a special short-term memory for processing spoken communication that we don't for processing written communication. One example of a modality effect. But again, there's many other kind of potential examples of modality effect. I thought I had a good example of the semantic priority, but I think you get the gist of the idea. Any question over any of our stuff? Because we are ready to change gears here and go into theories of nonverbal rather than language. So any questions over activation theory, top-down processing, attention theories, language and memory, restoration effect, modality effect? So many different kind of things that we could look at with language. But these are some pretty broad kinds of theories that, especially when you're talking about top-down processing and activation, that really encompass a wide variety of different kinds of information, very broad in their theoretical scope. With that, then, we'll switch gears a little bit, well, actually quite a bit, and talk about some of the theories, or at least theoretical perspectives, related to nonverbal communication. There's a lot of theories of nonverbal communication. We're not going to try to cover all the theories. There's one in particular theory, or a couple of theoretical implications that I'd like to at least key in on. Mainly what I want to do is kind of key in, at least structurally, identify different theoretical perspectives of nonverbal, different approaches, theoretical approaches to the study of nonverbal, and that does suggest a variety of specific theories and a variety of specific concepts and stuff like that. One thing that we just want to do at the onset, and again, I would hope this is a review for everybody, given that haven't all of you got 110? Anybody that didn't have SB 110 interpersonal? That's right, we talked about that before. Well, and you didn't either?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
Well, you'll get the gist of it in general, because this is pretty easy to explain. One distinction that's made theoretically within the study of nonverbal communication is distinguishing nonverbal behavior from nonverbal communication. And it's a technical but an important distinction to make. Nonverbal behavior is anything that's done nonverbally. Every behavior doesn't communicate a message. So when we say nonverbal communication, it doesn't mean everything we do nonverbally. It means the things we do nonverbally that convey or communicate some kind of meaning. Okay, so it's still really broad. I mean, nonverbal communication is tremendously a broad area, but it doesn't mean everything that's a behavior is nonverbal communication. It's only the behaviors that have some kind of meaning attached to it that communicates meaning.
But doesn't everything have a meaning though? Like, let's say my behavior is I take a drink of water, that means like I'm thirsty, that's a meaning, right?
There's a meaning there, yeah, as well. It doesn't mean every single thing does. I mean, for example, I don't know if any of you noticed or not, but just in the last 3 seconds, I just tapped my foot 3 times. Now, I don't know that that necessarily conveys any specific meaning. There's a lot of just idiosyncratic behaviors that we do that wouldn't necessarily communicate. But you're right in bringing up that example. There's a lot of subtle behaviors that really communicate quite a bit of things. Now, again, our focus is going to be sticking a little more mainstream in terms of like nonverbal communication as it relates to interpersonal. But this is a really broad area. I mean, and in some other classes, we go into completely different offshoots of this. For example, in the persuasion class, Dave, you had that, right? Yeah. Just last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, last semester.
Or last fall.
Yeah.
3 semesters ago.
Whatever.
Well, for example,
I had it.
One of the things that I do in the persuasion class You know, the first part of the persuasion class, we do like theories of attitude and formation and change. Second part of the class, we do propaganda and political communication. And in the third unit, we do social movements. And just look at all the nonverbal communication that's involved with social movements. And we go into a lot of detail in terms of things like marches and demonstrations and symbolic displays of a protest movement and things like that. Tremendously, big important area of nonverbal communication. In my communication in the arts class, my SB 404 class, obviously we do lots of stuff there. We're not looking at interpersonal communication, but we're looking at things like what does this style of painting communicate? What does this style of music communicate? You know, I mean, just think of all the different kinds of artistic, nonverbal expressions of meaning that exist in the arts. And again, that's an area that we focus a large part of the entire semester on. Now, we do a lot of verbal communication and linguistic, you know, in terms of things like poetry and literature and stuff like that. But a lot of that's nonverbal. So this is really a really broad area. There's even stuff in the study of cross-cultural communication that basically looks at an area that's called chronemics. Just by the word chronemics, your morphological root being chrono, what would that have something to do with? Time, yeah, like a chronometer or chronological. And one of the things that's been found in cross-cultural studies, and I might talk about this a little more in our third unit, is they've identified that different cultures actually have completely different perceptions of time and the way that time has meaning to them, which is basically related to the study of chronemics, which is how time communicates. Some of you may be familiar with these terms. Some cultures are identified as M time, which means monochronic time. Some are identified as P time, which is polychronic time. And the difference is, in our culture, and a lot of highly industrialized cultures, they're much more monochronic, which is where we see time as something that we measure by hours and minutes and days. It's a very, rationally mathematical kind of look at the progression of time, even though that is all artificial, right? I mean, the whole idea of clock time is completely artificial. That's why every 4 years we have to have a leap year, because it takes the Earth 365 days and 6 hours to go around the sun. So every 4 years, we've got an extra 24 hours. So what do? We plug in a February 29th and say, okay, now it's balanced out. That kind of shows that complete artificial creation of that kind of clock time. The other thing with monochronic time is we tend to see time in terms of the linear progression rather than progression of events. And that's for polychronic time. Polychronic time, they're much more likely to see time in terms of a sequence of events rather than a series of minutes and hours and days. They're much more likely to see time in a cyclical kind of way rather than a linear kind of way. A good example of polychronic time is young kids. Young kids tend to see time, especially really young, they tend to see time in terms of events that precede or proceed each other rather than actual clock time in terms of hours and days. Still, one personal experience that I remember this very fondly, when my son was really young and we were living in Texas when I was in grad school, and he was just like 3 years old at the time, and he was going to go to Florida to visit relatives. It was like around Christmas time, and I'm all upset and sad and everything because I'm going to miss him even though he's only going to be gone for a short period of time. And he just comes up to me and he looks up at me and he says, well, don't be sad, Dad, because right now I'm leaving, and the next thing that happens is I come back. And I mean, for him, it's not a matter of days or hours or weeks or anything like that. It's one event that's then preceded by another event. Animals will do that a lot of times as well. If you happen to give your dog dinner after you have your coffee at 5 o'clock in the evening, the dog doesn't always recognize that there's a certain amount of minutes or hours. They're looking at it in terms of events. You've had your 5 o'clock coffee, so where's my supper? Without realizing that the clock time that might be between the coffee and the supper and that kind of thing. So now, again, as kids grow up and stuff, in our culture at least, they get more used to monochronic time. Well, I don't want to get too much off on the idea of chronemics, but that's just another area of nonverbal in terms of how we perceive time differently and the different kinds of communication and meaning that we attribute to them. Now to get a little more, a little more specifically focused on our specific different theoretical approaches. And this is much more looking at the study of interpersonal communication in terms of the different theoretical approaches that you can take with nonverbal. And I'm going to give you a little more specific elaboration of theoretical approaches than you're getting in your text, but I do want to overlap the two so you can see the way that they're interrelated. In the text, the distinction that they make is when we're looking at elements of nonverbal communication, we're oftentimes making distinctions between the origins, in other words, where do these nonverbal behaviors and the meaning we attribute to them come from. They also look at the coding in terms of how do we relate the meaning to the message, and they also look at the usage in terms of the functional, practical, pragmatic things that nonverbals do for us when we're talking about using it interpersonally to communicate. So when I go through these theoretical approaches, at least for a few of these, I do want to relate them back to these three dimensions, so you see the continuity between the origin, coding, and usage distinction and the actual specific theoretical approaches. These are more looking at taxonomical kind of theoretical approach, you know, in terms of three different types of things that you're looking at, rather than just, you know, an entire different theoretical approach.
Can you repeat what coding is really fast, sorry?
Coding is the relationship between the behavior and the meaning we attribute to it. And again, we'll go into more detail on each of these. One theoretical approach, and this theoretical approach directly relates to the focus on origins, is the ethological approach. I don't know if any of you recognize the root here, but ethology means the origin of things. So the ethological theoretical approach to nonverbal, you're trying to understand the origins of where certain behaviors come from. Now the origins can be varied. Some ethological theoretical approaches actually look to evolutionary explanations. For instance, one of the more common examples is the human need for personal space. You know how we all have this need for some kind of like personal space. It's almost like our bodies physically extend beyond ourselves, and if somebody encroaches upon our personal space, we react uncomfortably, much the same as we would as though we were actually threatened or something like that. We felt some kind of risk. Well, the ethological explanation is that's a very primal evolutionary development, right? Look throughout the animal kingdom. Almost every species that has some kind of reasonably developed central nervous system, they have this sense of territoriality, where if there's a creature that encroaches on the animal's territory, they don't wait until you actually physically grab them or something. They respond with either fight, aggress the aggressor, flight, run away, or warn off the aggressor. And it just, you know, just makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that that's a very primal kind of instinct. You know, the basis idea of evolutionary theory, at least one of them, survival of the fittest, doesn't it just make logical sense that if we defend a sense of territory, we're going to be more able to protect ourselves, which makes us more fit for survival. And so a very fundamental Darwinian kind of explanation for that personal space is that's developed in species as a result of evolution, because it's a characteristic that would make a species more fit for survival and better able to protect itself, which means they're better able to propagate themselves as well. And we even react this way instinctively a lot of times when it logically doesn't make sense. One of the things that a lot of times people will do if they feel uncomfortable or somebody's encroaching on their personal space, they'll oftentimes do something like turn sideways, take a step back, look away, and cross their arms. Well, right there, they've just done 3 or 4 things that would make you more physically protected, right? You take a step back, you turn sideways so you're not as vulnerable. Crossing the arms is an instinctive way of protecting the solar plexus, which is one of the more vulnerable parts of the human body. And so we instinctively do these kinds of things to protect ourselves, even though we're not really feeling physically threatened. So some of these ethological explanations are really broad in terms of looking at evolutionary kinds of characteristics. Another sort of evolutionary ethological example is, and I use this in the interpersonal class this semester, is the whites of the human eyes. I don't know if any of you ever noticed this, but human beings are the only species on Earth that has the predominant whites of the eyes. Well, the whites of our eyes do nothing to help us see. That's all the lens and the retina and things like that. What the whites of the eyes, or let me ask you, what is the communicative result of the whites of our eyes?
It's like if you see more light, you're like surprised, or like, it's like your eyes are communicative. They're like if this girl was like, her eyes got really big, I'd be like, whoa, it's okay, like.
Not only do we get a lot of information, which is a good example, But isn't the eye behavior more conspicuous as well?
Yep.
Because back to your same example, if Olivia, who's this girl,
Sorry, I didn't know your name.
if Olivia's eyes got really broad, if it wasn't for the whites of the eyes, that wouldn't be as noticeable of the behavior. I mean, yeah, the eyelids and the muscles around the eye would move, but it wouldn't be as noticeable, because of the whites of the eyes. And not just that specific behavior, but even look at the distance. I mean, you could look at somebody a reasonably far distance away, much further than looking at you folks in the back row, and you can see exactly where somebody's looking, and if it wasn't for the whites of the eyes, there's no way that we would be able to, eye behavior wouldn't be as conspicuous as it is. Well, how does that relate to human nonverbal communication? Look at how much we rely on eye behavior as a very strong, very influential, dimension of interpersonal communication. If it wasn't for the whites of the eyes evolving the way they have in the human species, we would not use eye behavior nearly as much and rely on it and be influenced nearly as much as what we typically are. Was there a hand in a second?
I was gonna say that can attribute to the eyebrows as well with communication for isn't a lot of nonverbal when it comes to the eyes done through eyebrows and all that shenanigans.
Yeah, a lot of what we think is eye behavior isn't really the eye itself, it's the muscles around the eye and things like that. Yeah, it's a good point. Although if the eyes, back to Caitlin's example, if the eyes widened, it wouldn't just be the muscle movement, it would be that suddenly now we saw more white as well. So, an ethological approach, looking at the origins, it could be something like evolution. There's some other things, though, you could focus on, too.
I guess when you were referring to the whites of the eyes, using Caitlin's example of her, if she's looking this way, and she knows that her eye, she can see lots of the white in her eyes, but she looks very surprised or worried, is it also in kind of like a social activity? Well, there's something behind me that could be a threat.
Oh, and so do you mean a different reason that you might open your eyes?
She might not be looking at her, but if she's looking at the door and her eyes are really wide, that's sending a message with, like, maybe a potential threat to Caitlin, as she sees her being worried.
Okay, sure. Just another example of how we'd use the eyes as a message?
Yeah, that was more of a kind of a question. I guess I didn't quite totally understand, what you were explaining.
Basically, what I was, in terms of the ethological, is saying that for interpersonal nonverbal, we really rely on eye behavior a lot. We notice it, we get a lot of information from it. One of the reasons for that is because of the whites of the eyes that have evolved through evolution. So that's just kind of an ethological example. So the ethological could be something like evolutionarily, where does the behavior come from? Ethological could also look at things like development within our lifetime in terms of explaining the origins of certain kinds of behavior. Another example I talked with in the interpersonal class is the human infant's need for touch at birth. This is a very basic kind of instinct that human infants need touch at birth. They're comforted by tactile sensation. It could be that you're holding them, wrapping a blanket around them. Human infants are born already with a need for birth. Well, the ethological explanation for this basically comes from looking at interspecial comparisons, and one of the things that you notice is all mammals are born with the need for touch. It's not something that just humans have, it's something that all mammals have. Now, there may be an exception with the duck-billed platypus, but let's leave him aside for just a moment. So, you have to ask yourself, what common characteristic in terms of birth do all mammals have? Besides being being warm-blooded and having hair, what's the other common characteristic with mammals? They give live birth. And so the most logical theoretical explanation for the need for humans, infant at birth, or need for touch at birth, isn't because we're human, it's because we're a mammal. And the idea is prenatal conditioning, that in the conditioning stage, before the infant's even born, they're completely surrounded by that tactile sensation. They're all the embryonic fluid. They feel all the motion and all the swinging of the mother's body. It's a complete kind of cozy little tactile sensation. So what happens at the moment of birth? We take that infant out of that cozy tactile environment, and now they're just here, exposed to the world. And that's why even things like wrapping a blanket around a baby or holding a baby is very comforting. You're recreating some of that prenatal sensation of having that touch wrapped around the baby. If you've ever looked at or seen a litter of kittens or a litter of puppies in the newborn stage when they sleep, they don't all go off to their own little corners of the room to sleep. They very often pile themselves on top of each other in a big ball. That's recreating the fetal state. That's exactly the way they were in the mother cat or the mother dog. They were all balled up on each other, and that's the condition they're recreating when they pile themselves up on top of each other. Even the idea of how rocking a baby is so comforting to an infant. Can you see the prenatal conditioning there? Because in the gestation period, the baby is feeling that swaying motion, you know, going back and forth in the embryonic fluid in the mother's womb. And so when you hold a baby and you're rocking a baby in your arms or rocking the baby in a rocking chair, that's a very comforting sensation because you're recreating that rocking sensation that the baby was experiencing in the prenatal stage. So just another kind of example of an ethological approach where you're theoretically explaining why is it that human infants are born with the need for touch. We don't explain it in terms of evolution, we explain it in terms of the gestation period of mammals, all mammals. Now the reason I say the duck-billed platypus is because it's the only mammal that lays eggs. But all other mammals give birth to live young, and that becomes the ethological explanation for that need for touch at birth. One other quick example, lots of research has shown, and a lot of you may already know this anyway, a lot of research has shown that infants after birth already can recognize immediately, they can recognize the sound of their mother's speech and their mother's voice at birth. Well, obviously, you're not genetically programmed up somehow to be able to recognize, you know, the sound of your mother's voice. It's another example of prenatal conditioning. That, you know, we process sound in different ways. There's air conduction, fluid conduction, neurochemical conduction, and bone conduction. But fluid conduction is how sound can still transmit through fluid, you know, the embryonic fluid. Now, the tonal qualities are different, but what the baby does recognize that is already conditioned before birth is the rhythmic speech patterns of the mother's voice, where, you know, they're recognizing the speech pattern of the mother. And some of you may know this as well, there's been research done where a mother will read a story out loud for several weeks before she actually delivers the baby, and then after the baby is born, the baby will oftentimes be more comforted by that story being read, that the mother read when the baby was still in the womb, compared to other stories. Well, again, the baby's not recognizing the book, I really liked The Cat in the Hat before I was born. What they're recognizing is the mother's speech pattern when she reads the book. And some studies have even shown, one in particular I'm thinking of, that the baby even responds to that story when somebody else reads it, which means they're not just recognizing the mother's voice, they're even recognizing the rhythmic speech pattern of the story itself. Brittany?
I was just gonna ask, like, so would, like, PTSD, like, could that fall under this in the sense that, like, if, like, for soldiers who come back and they have that, like, is that, like, where they examine it, cause, like, that's the origin of, like, their behavior, is that?
Yeah, trying to understand the origins of where these particular behaviors came from. Yeah, that's a good example of applying this approach to a specific individual or a specific condition instead of like to the whole species or something. Yeah, that's a really good example. Where did this particular thing come from? I guess you could even do some things like that with, you know, let's say that somebody is really touch phobic, and some of us probably know with it, some people just really don't feel comfortable being touched. You know, and you might do sort of an ethological analysis trying to go back and say, where in your lifetime, because that's not a very natural thing. You know, humans are supposed to thrive on touch. Where in your life does that come from in terms of, you know, being afraid of touch or not being comfortable with touch? Another good example. You know what she means by PTSD, post-traumatic stress, or PT. You said D, and you post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Oh, yeah.
Or disorder, that's the reason why, PTSS or PTSD, yeah, the disorder. So, ethological could be looking at evolutionary explanations. It could be looking at origins and explanations within our own development as a species, or, as Brittany points out, within an individual's experience in lifetime. And some ethological analysis can even just go back and look at the social history in terms of where did particular nonverbal behaviors originate. You know, a couple of the examples I've used in the interpersonal classes, like the, you know, the origin of the act of shaking hands, you know, and that comes from like Middle Ages to 17th, 18th century England, where a warrior or a knight would expose his open hand, showing that he didn't have a weapon, and that was a sign of friendship, and that eventually evolved into the meaning that extending your hand to somebody is a sign of friendship. Or the military salute, same time period, where knights would raise their visor when approaching another knight as a sign of kinship and camaraderie, and that motion of raising the visor is eventually what evolved into the military salute. So you could also be looking at explanations in terms of just social history. You know, where did this particular behavior or where did the meanings come from? So you could be looking at evolutionary explanations, you could be looking at evolutionary or explanations within the development of our lifetime, or you could be looking at social history. Where did the meaning from that originate, you know, historically? One of the kinds of distinctions, and some of this you can see that we've already implied anyway, or two of the kinds of distinctions you're making with this ethological approach, and again, it directly relates to the idea of origins. One thing is whether a behavior is innate or learned. You know, innate means it's a natural thing. Learned is something that we've learned through conditioning, and we've already given examples of some of those. The need for touch at birth, is that learned or is that innate? That's learned, it's just learned in the prenatal stage. The recognition of the mother's voice at birth, learned or innate. When you're not genetically wired up to recognize mom's voice, that's something that's learned, it's just learned in the prenatal stage. So innate is something that we're physiologically or biologically already programmed to do. Learned is something that we've been conditioned to do, and the conditioning can begin in the prenatal stage. There are some examples of innate behavior, though. A classic example would be the facial expression of our basic emotions: happy, sad, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy. Those are neuromuscular responses. When the afferent pathways of the brain experience a certain emotional situation, at least one of those, happy, sad, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy, the facial muscles are literally neurologically wired into those pathways of the brain, and it creates a neuromuscular response. The emotional response in the brain stimulates the muscular response in the face. Nobody, back to the example of Olivia looking surprised or startled, if that was the expression when you open your eyes real wide, nobody had to teach you how to look surprised, right? You know, a little baby, a little puppy, they'll be surprised when there's a sudden noise or a sudden sound. That's an innate response, the way we respond to sudden kind of stimuli as a shock. Some of you may have even seen pictures of infants expressing emotions, those basic emotions: happy, sad, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy. They're exactly the same as an adult. You could look at an 8-month-old baby in terms of those basic facial expressions, and you can very clearly see exactly what the emotion is that the infant is expressing. That's too young to have learned that stuff as an infant. That's neuromuscular programming. And another kind of example that absolutely shows this is an innate thing is people that are sightless since birth. They've never seen another person's facial expression. They don't have the sense of sight. They will express those facial expressions the exact same way as a sighted person would. There's no other possible theoretical explanation. How could a person without sight express the same facial expression the same way from the same emotion as seeing people? It has to be because they're somehow biologically, physiologically, you know, programmed to respond that way. That's also why those basic expressions, happy, sad, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy, those are cross-cultural universals. All people in all cultures throughout the world express those emotions the exact same way. So, you know, anytime you find something like that, it's a pretty good indication there must be something biologically going on in there. Another distinction that you make here, in addition to just as something learned or something innate, and this is a good spin-off of what I was just talking about with cross-cultural, and that is a particular nonverbal behavior species constant or species variant. And I think you kind of infer what those words mean. Species constant means this is something that is the same for all people everywhere. Variant means it varies. Maybe it varies between cultures, maybe it varies between people. This is one of the big reasons for a lot of intercultural studies of nonverbal communication. One of the underlying theoretical things that you're looking at is this something that all humans do the same in every culture, or is this something that different cultures do differently? If you find things that different cultures do differently, it also suggests some really important theoretical implications for the how and the why. If you have consistent differences in one culture compared to another, oftentimes that's a reflection of certain cultural attitudes and values. Back to the example you had mentioned a minute ago, even though you're talking about India instead of the Mideast, about things like covering the face and stuff like that. I mean, just look in some of the countries in the Mideast where women have to cover every single part of their body except their hands and their eyes, which is what you functionally can't cover. You need your hands, you have to be able to see, but from head, including their hair, down to their feet, even the veil across the face, every part of their body is covered. Well, what's that saying about the culture? Obviously, they have some very traditional, very rigid, very conservative standards about how inappropriate it is for a woman to display any part of her body except what absolutely has to be, displayed, which are the hands and the eyes. And that also says, again, I don't mean to be picking on any cultures and saying anything negative, but that also communicates an idea in terms of their different standards for men and women, because there's not nearly the same rigid standards for the way the male has to dress in those countries as the way females have to dress in those countries, and so that's telling us a lot about their cultural attitudes. There's been a lot of studies done on touch and the frequency of the public display of affection in some cultures like the United States compared with cultures like Japan and Korea. And one of the things that the research has very clearly shown is when you're looking at some of these far eastern countries, far Asian countries like Japan and Korea, there's not near the amount of public display of affection because they have very, very, very rigid social customs and standards. These are the kinds of things that you do in private. And even in private, they don't have near the amount of public display or the near amount of physical affection as we see in certain other cultures. And so when you see these differences, it's usually tied into some kind of cultural attitude. I don't want to get too much off on a tangent, but I think this is too good of an example not to mention. It's not interpersonal. But look at even the things that we use to rate or move. Now, we are varying a little bit from just ethological with this example. But even the standards that we use when we rate our movies, like are they, G, PG-13, R, those kinds of things. Two kinds of things, verbal and nonverbal, we use for our standards. The verbal is profanity. The nonverbal is graphic violence or graphic sexuality. And there's a lot of countries around the world that have a complete reversal of that nonverbal. We tend to put a lot more rigid standards on sexuality to rate a movie R, like if there's frontal nudity, even tasteful artistic nudity, frontal nudity, even just from the waist up, let's say a female, that's going to be R17 and a kid under 17 can't go see it. On the other hand, look at the tremendously violent, graphic violent movies, that's PG-13. The Terminator movie, how many people blown up and completely, destroyed and killed in that movie, that's a PG-13 movie. So in some cultures around the world, it's exactly the reverse. They're much more likely to say it's perfectly normal and natural for a kid to see artistic expression of nudity, but we don't want them seeing this graphic kind of violence. And they're much more likely to rate a more stringent kind of thing. And in a lot of countries, they don't even allow some of those movies in there. We just become so desensitized and used to these things in our culture, we don't realize that now some of you, if you talk to people from another country, they come over and they watch one of these movies and they go, how in the world do you find this kind of thing entertaining? Because in their culture, they're just not exposed to that. So there's some other kind of things, though, that these variations in nonverbal tell us about the culture, and it tells us things about the cultural attitudes and stuff like that. One of the things that you can see that we're kind of relating here is a difference between, and I've used these terms before without actually spelling them out, the difference between phylogenetic and ontogenetic characteristics. A phylogenetic characteristic is something that is innate. Phylogenetic means it's genetic, it's biologically determined. So something that is innate is phylogenetic. It's a biological characteristic of the species. Your phylogenetic characteristics do not change depending upon where you're born. The number of ears you have doesn't differ depending upon what country you were given birth in. Ontogenetic characteristics are things that are learned or conditioned. Now again, ontogenetic conditioning and learning could come from a variety of things. It could be ontogenetic conditioning in us as a species, like the need for touch at birth, recognizing the mother's voice, something that we still share in common. Or ontogenetic things could be things that our culture has conditioned us to. Different standards from country to country in what is a normal interpersonal distance. Different standards from country to country in terms of eye behaviors, these kinds of things. All kinds of the different examples like we were giving in terms of different cultures conditioning people different ways. And, back to Brittany's example and a couple of the other kind of examples, ontogenetic could also be just things that has affected an individual in his or her lifetime. It just means that it's something that was learned or conditioned. you can't always make a distinction in whether something's species constant or variant. I mean, when you see something as species constant or variant, you can't always make the distinction in terms of whether it's phylogenetic or ontogenetic, because you notice that some of the ontogenetic things we're talking about, which are learned, not innate, they're still species constant though, right? The need for touch at birth, that's cross-culturally the same, it's species constant. Recognizing the mother's voice, that's species constant. So just because something's species constant doesn't mean that it's phylogenetic, because there are ontogenetic things that are species constant too. However, if something is cross-culturally variant, if it differs from country to country, then you know it has to be ontogenetic, right? Because your phylogenetic characteristics don't change. Questions on that? So if we observe something that's the same everywhere, you don't really know whether it's phylogenetic or ontogenetic. Phylogenetic things are always going to be the same, but some ontogenetic things are as well. If you see something different from culture to culture, you know it has to be species variant, or it has to be ontogenetic. That's just a little bit of background in terms of the ethological approach and the kinds of things you're looking at and the kinds of variety of different theories. I mean, the ethological isn't a theory, it's a theoretical approach. And in just our discussion of examples and stuff, we've talked about a whole variety of different kinds of theories, but they all would fall under that ethological approach, because in one way or another, they're looking for the origins of nonverbal. Where does it come from? It might be from evolution, it might be from basic conditioning as human beings, or it might be some kind of social conditioning or social, history, that kind of thing, but it's still looking at the origins. A second theoretical approach, and I won't go into as much detail on this one, is the body language approach. The body language approach tends to focus a lot more on the meaning of nonverbal behaviors and what's communicated. For instance, there's been a lot of research and theory and stuff like this on, and I know you guys know this either intuitively or remember this from other classes, the idea in terms of the fact that we get a lot more meaning from the nonverbal communication than we do from the verbal. Studies will vary here, but most of the studies will say that anywhere from 60% to 95% of the meaning we get in at least interpersonal communication actually comes from the nonverbal channels. And there's a whole variety of theories that explain, how and why we get so much more information from the nonverbal. Also, there's been a lot of, stuff focusing on the idea that when there's inconsistency between the verbal and the nonverbal, in other words, you get one message verbally, but you get another message nonverbally, as adults, which are we obviously more likely to believe? We believe the nonverbal, and the underlying theoretical explanation there is we know that it's more difficult to control nonverbal. You can say anything you want with your words, but it's a lot harder to manipulate or disguise what you're thinking and what you're feeling with all the nonverbal and everything. I mean, you're talking about body movements and body posture and eyes and tone of voice. Don't forget that nonverbal isn't just the physical characteristics, there's also the audible characteristics in terms of things like your tone of voice. When somebody's really nervous, it's, in your classes, when somebody stands up to give a speech, you can usually tell when they're really nervous or when they're really anxious. No matter how much they're trying to conceal that, for most people, it's a very difficult thing to do. Now, I have mentioned, and I mentioned this in the interpersonal class, young children, really young children, like especially around the age of 5 to 7, when they're communicating with adults like their parents, that's one subject group that tends to believe the verbal more than the nonverbal. Can you see why, theoretically, why would that be? Why would young kids talking with their parents be more likely to believe the verbal instead of the nonverbal? There's really two explanations.
Well, they haven't had experience with a lot of nonverbal stuff yet.
One thing is they haven't learned the nonverbal. That's one of the reasons why little kids are such bad liars. I mean, you can look at a kid that's lying and you kind of know. Not that learning how to lie is a good communication skill to develop, but little kids haven't learned how much that gives them away. Were you going to say something different?
I was gonna say the same thing, but it also just could be because with their parents, they're gonna take their parents' word for what is true.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of deference to what the parents say. Yeah, so if mom says this, if dad says this, then it must be true, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of deference to the parents. So these kinds of things would fall within the body language approach. A lot of the body language approach also is a lot of this stuff, and I know you had this, so I don't need to go through the detail, but all the differences in male and female nonverbal behaviors, especially in our culture, and there's a whole variety of different kinds of explanations and different lists of differences between male and female, nonverbal. At one distant time in the past, that was actually addressed ethologically, saying, is this innate or is this learned? The difference between male and female nonverbal. And one of the things that makes it very clear that it's learned rather than innate is when you look at some other cultures around the world, they don't have nearly as much differences between men and women as we do in ours. In our culture, for example, men are not as touch-oriented with other men as women are with other women. Women will hug each other and friendly kisses and hold hands and their arms around each other and these kinds of things. Guys don't usually do that. One of the examples I've used in the interpersonal class is you can go into something like a movie theater. If there's a whole bunch of seats, guys will usually space seats in between themselves, whereas women will sit next to each other. And if you are sitting next to each other, who gets the armrest? For the guys, you don't share an armrest with your arms leaning on each other. One guy has the armrest, the other guy puts his arm up, and you quickly kind of move it away. So one guy's sitting like this, and the other guy's got the armrest. Women don't think anything at all about having your arms touch on the armrest or something like that. Well, when you look at other cultures around the world, a lot of the cultures, men are not nearly as phobic of nonverbal contact with other men. I mean, the Italians, for example, males will greet other males with kisses on the cheeks. In India, males are very tactily oriented in terms of hugging and things like this. So that kind of becomes an absolute kind of argument that the differences between male and female in our culture, it's not innate. It's not because of the biology of men, bless you, compared to the biology of women. It's something that has been learned. Some cultures condition that men are supposed to be very distant from each other, and women, some cultures say, it's okay. Another example I used in the interpersonal class this semester, actually I typically use, is when you go to a straight bar or any place where there's dancing, and women don't usually think anything at all about dancing with other women. Sally says, Beth, I like this song, come up and dance with me. Usually Bob doesn't say, hey Frank, come up and dance with me, I really like this song. I mean, we think entirely different things about it, when really, there's no reason that we necessarily should. The body language approach, since we're looking at meaning, the body language approach relates a lot to the coding, which, as I said earlier, is what's the relationship between the behavior and the meaning. And your classic distinctions here in terms of the relationship between the behavior and the meaning, in terms of the coding, is one is an iconic relationship, and the iconic relationship is where the nonverbal behavior actually visually looks like or resembles what the message is. You're literally mimicking out what the message is. When you travel in another country and you don't speak the language, but you're looking for a restaurant, you don't usually have any problem walking up to somebody in that culture and mimicking out the action of eating, and they pretty much get the idea you're looking for a restaurant. A parent that tells their child to be quiet in public without saying a word, cover your mouth, indicating something smells bad without saying anything, you cover your nose or something like this. So, the iconic connection in terms of the coding there, what's the connection between the behavior and the meaning? The iconic, and icon means visual. The iconic connection is the behavior actually physically looks like the meaning. Your other distinction is an arbitrary relationship or connection. The arbitrary is where there's no physical resemblance at all. It just means what it means because that's what we arbitrarily, symbolically say it means. When you hold up two fingers to mean peace, there's nothing about that that looks like the concept of peaceness. It just means what it means because that's what we say. Waving, just an arbitrary connection. It just means what it means because that's what we say it means. Now, there are some times that we become so conditioned to the arbitrary connection of a behavior and the meaning, we think it's iconic, but it's really not. One example is shrugging the shoulders to indicate you don't know something. Some people would say, well, that's iconic because that looks like the meaning. But when you really think about it, there's nothing about that motion that looks like the concept of I don't understand. And actually, there's some cultures in the world that has a completely different kind of meaning. So, lots of different kinds of examples there of where a behavior, or even waving, I think. Some people might think that's iconic, but there's nothing about that that looks like the concept of hello or goodbye. It's just that we become so used to it, we think it looks like it, but really it just means what it means because that's what we say.
Is shaking your head like yes or no the same like that too?
That's really good that you bring that up. I was thinking about that. generally speaking, it's an arbitrary connection, but ethologically speaking, somebody could make the argument, at least for the shaking of the head no, that it's iconic, and the reason for that is it has been shown that most cultures around the world, now there's an exception with Bulgaria, I think, and I think there's at least 1 or 2 other countries where they reverse it. The back and forth means yes instead of no. But because of the cross-cultural similarity in the back and the forth meaning no, some ethological explanation is that comes from infancy, because it's a natural instinctive thing for a human infant. When you're going to feed them, if they're rejecting the food, they don't like it, they're tired, they're full or something like that, it's an instinctive reaction to turn the head sideways. And so the ethological explanation is, because that's such a natural thing in infancy, it makes sense that so many cultures around the world would have evolved the meaning that shaking of the head no means no, and somehow the opposite, up and down, means yes. So for the no, somebody could make that argument. There is an iconic relationship, even though most of the time you're not thinking of infants rejecting food, but there would be a fuzzy area there. That's a really good example to bring up. I want to come back real quick to the iconic and arbitrary in a minute, but let me mention our third connection, which is an intrinsic connection. The intrinsic connection is where there's a direct physical link between the behavior and what's being expressed, or the meaning behind the behavior. Our example of the facial expressions, those basic expressions, happy, sad, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy, our explanation of those were intrinsic. That is a biological, natural thing, that the neuromuscular reaction of those emotions create certain kinds of facial expressions. Other obvious intrinsic examples would be things like crying or laughing. Nobody had to teach you how to do that. Another good example would be all of the nervous behaviors when somebody's in a state of anxiety, you know, the shaking of the hands and all that kind of stuff, which is a direct result of the accelerated metabolism in the body, and the body's somehow got to channel that excess energy. That's a natural, physical, you know, intrinsic kind of connection between the behavior and the meaning. So the iconic, it looks like the message. The arbitrary, it means what it means just because that was what we say. And the intrinsic, there's a physical link between the behavior and the meaning. So your innate behaviors would be intrinsic, right? There's some kind of physical, kind of biological connection. The one other thing I wanted to mention here with the arbitrary and the iconic is, and this is a little bit more semiotic in general, not just with nonverbal, this is also the technical distinction between what a sign is and a symbol is. A lot of times people interchangeably use the word sign and symbol, but the technical semiotic distinction between, you know, remember semiotics, the tradition is the study of signs and symbols. The technical distinction between a sign and a symbol is a sign looks like the message, where a symbol means something, but it doesn't bear a physical resemblance to the message. And that really is the more technical distinction in general between a sign and a symbol. There are some other approaches we're going to do, but we're not going to do them now. I want to talk to the group about their presentation last week. We still have a functional approach to do, which relates to the usage, and we still have actually 3 more approaches, a physiological approach and also a linguistic approach. So next week when we pick up, we'll go through our other 3 approaches, and then there's a specific theory that I want to get into as well. So remember to remind me where we left off. If I don't remember it, I'll probably remember where we left off.